Hi, everyone. My name is Rosa Acevedo, and it's such a pleasure to be here today. I will speak for myself, but to see all of the practitioners on the ground doing the work, it's amazing. We come at you from an external or outsider perspective, so please keep that in mind. This will be information heavy, so bear with us. My name is Rosa. I'm from the University of Texas at Austin. I'm a research fellow there. And presenting alongside me is Dr. Meredith Billings. She's an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Arlington. And today we're going to discuss 3 research projects, all related to funding and finances of Promise programs. The first project is a landscape analysis of how Promise programs are being funded nationally. The second project is a quantitative analysis around the spending of community colleges that have partnered with Promise programs. And the third project is a qualitative project that examines the support or the opposition to the adoption of the New Mexico Opportunity Scholarship by the state legislature. Well, it's missing a few slides, but we'll just keep going. For the purposes of this particular study, we operationalized a particular definition of Promise programs. We defined statewide Promise programs as those that met the following criteria. The first is that Promise programs that offered scholarships for eligible students to enroll in public community colleges and or technical colleges that focus on associate degrees. The second inclusion criteria were those that are sponsored by a state government or agency. And the third inclusion criteria was if that Promise program was started in the last 20 years. And our search yielded 33 programs across 28 unique states. Promise programs really use a variety of sources to fund scholarships, student support services, and staff members for programs. And these revenue streams consist of either private, public, or a combination of private and public sources, as you all have heard over the course of this institute. And so depending on the size of the program and the benefits offered and the available resources, Promise programs really need to consider how they will pay for current and future scholarship recipients. Typically, private sources include national, local, and post-secondary foundations, endowments, trusts, businesses, corporations, and individual donors. An example of a privately funded Promise program is the Lone Star College Promise Scholarship located in Texas, which is funded by the Lone Star College Foundation. And this scholarship covers tuition and fees for students that are attending for consecutive semesters at any Lone Star College campus. The other main source of funding for Promise programs is public sources, which include local and state appropriations, sales and property taxes, lottery funds, tax incremented financing, and other student financial aid. A common source of public funding, as you all know, used by 83% of Promise programs is federal and state financial aid, such as the federal Pell Grant or state aid grant to cover students' tuitions and fees before Promise scholarship dollars are applied. Promise programs are also funded through alternative and more creative means. An example of a privately funded Promise program that turned into a combination of funding is the Cuesta Promise in California. That began in 2013 and was made possible by a donation of over $8 million from the Charles and Lita Dovica Family Trust, whose benefactors requested that the money be used for scholarships. When the scholarship started, it allowed students to attend Cuesta College tuition-free for the first year. And then 5 years later, the program expanded to cover a second year due to the addition of new funding sources, including the California College Promise Grant, local donors, and the California Assembly Bill 19. Another example of funding from a combination of sources is the Michigan Promise Zones, which are 15 communities that have been designated as promise programs by the state. For the first 2 years of the program, the Michigan Promise Zones used private funding to cover all eligible students within their zone. Starting in their third year, they could use tax increment financing, which automatically captures half of the growth in the state education tax, also known as SET, within the boundary of each promise zone to help fund their programs. And hopefully we have the next slide, but no. Okay. To illustrate the variation in funding sources for promise programs, we conducted a policy scan of statewide promise programs and collected data on their funding sources. We limited promise programs, as I mentioned before, to those that were just sponsored or created by a state agency, those that were started in the last 20 years, and those that offer a scholarship at a technical or community college. We found that 33 programs across 28 states, as I mentioned before. We had a map, and it was pretty nice, and Hawaii was not depicted on the map, but we wanted to point out that it is there through the Hawaii Promise Program, which is funded through state sources. And the map showed you that programs are funded by funding sources by 93%, with most requiring annual or biannual appropriations from the state legislature. 5 statewide programs are partially funded by or accepted donations from private entities. And then lastly, 6 programs are partially funded by the federal pandemic relief funds. COVID-19 funding sources really have been viewed, or some have viewed COVID-19 funding sources as unreliable because they tend to be non-recurring and are set to be exhausted in 1 to 2 years. Promise programs have had to adapt to seismic shifts prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has led to a significant contraction in state and local government budgets. And this plays a crucial role in funding promise programs. This contraction was primarily due to economic activity caused by the pandemic. Higher education institutions, especially public ones, faced reductions in state support, in tuition, and fee revenue due to enrollment declines in 2021. And institutions also incurred increased spending on various pandemic-related needs, such as online learning, infrastructures, personal protective equipment, health insurance costs, and student reimbursements. So, and impacts from the private sector, they saw that businesses were experiencing reduced income during the pandemic, which really affected their ability to contribute to promise programs. Philanthropic giving was also affected, though the net effect on promise programs remains unclear due to reduced in-person fundraising opportunities. And all the while, there was an increased demand for promise program services. And the pandemic created this higher demand for financial resources, wraparound supports, especially among ethno-racially minoritized students and those with low socioeconomic backgrounds. And so in response to the shifting financial context, promise programs implemented several changes. Some promise programs, like the Tennessee Promise, relaxed their eligibility criteria. Tennessee Promise reduced their community service hours during that time. Certain programs, like the Indiana's Workforce Ready Grant, became more generous by increasing amounts from $5,000 to $10,000 for eligible students. Whereas other Promise programs had to impose stricter eligibility criteria and reduce the benefits due to the fiscal challenges that they were facing and the concerns about a longer-term economic recession. So, for example, the Oregon Promise reinstated a financial need cap of $22,000 due to their budget cuts from the state legislature, leading some students to lose their Promise award if their income exceeded that limit. Another example is the New York Excelsior program, which reduced the number of students who were offered scholarships and the size of the awards. Most statewide programs that we identified in our landscape analysis of funding sources really relied heavily on annual or biannual appropriations from the state legislature. And this funding reliance may lead to broken promises to students in some years if the funding is not sufficient to meet student demand. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, some states had to reduce total scholarships award per students. They had to revoke scholarships or place promised students on waiting lists because of insufficient funds due to their budget cuts. And so we have two recommendations based off of our policy scan. And the first is recommending that Promise programs seek to diversify their funding sources to the extent possible and use a mix of public and private sources because these models really allow programs more leeway if some revenue streams fall short during certain periods of time. The most financially vulnerable programs, like I said, are those that rely on annual fundraising, which leads to a high level of uncertainty, and those funded by colleges and their foundations. And so, given this, Promise programs should really seek out more stable funding sources, such as endowments, a trust, tax incremented financing, or other non-discretionary funding sources. So programs are not overly reliant on funding that is annually or biannually appropriated and subject to the economic and political fluctuations or conditions of the state and community. So again, I know that's a lot of information with like 3 PowerPoint slides, but we're going to go ahead and shift our focus to how Promise programs are situated in community colleges and how they spend their money. And Dr. Billings will take the lead.
All right. Thank you, Rosa. I'm going to stand up just because I find it a little bit awkward to be looking back. So like Rosa said, we're going to now shift to thinking about how do community colleges that partner with Promise programs, how do they spend their money? So yesterday and today, we've been talking a lot about if we're inducing students to go to college, we really want to make sure that when they're in college, they're navigating that successfully and they're getting their degrees. And so what we might think that's going to happen if a community college is partnering with a Promise program, they might be spending their money in different ways once that Promise program gets started, because you might be inducing students who wouldn't go to college into college, and they need more student supports to get through college. So in this project, we had 2 research questions, and I'm really only going to focus on the interest of time on the second research question, which is looking at, does the effect of the Promise program implementation on community college expenditures vary by the funding source for the Promise program? So looking at, do community colleges spend their money differently if the Promise program is publicly funded as opposed to privately funded, as opposed to there's a combination of sources? And so for this project, we looked at 30 local promise programs that coupled with a single institution that was a community college. And these are across the nation, shown on here by this map. And so essentially, these programs started in a 10-year period, so somewhere between 2003 up to 2013. And so we compared them to a group of community colleges, 37 of them across the nation, that eventually started a Promise program, but it was outside of the time period of our study. And these end up being really great comparison groups because some of the concerns, if you just compare a community college with a Promise program, one without, perhaps that community college that doesn't have that Promise program looks very different to a community college with a Promise program. So you try, at least on the researcher side, to get as close as possible when you're thinking about what the comparison group could be. And so what we did is we used the IPEDS data, and if you're not familiar with that, it stands for the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, and it's collected by the National Center for Educational Statistics in the federal government. So all post-secondary institutions, whether they're public, private, or for-profit, if they participate in the federal financial aid program, they're required to submit their information each year to the federal government. And so we were interested using the IPEDS finance data to look at our community college really changing their spending after they partner with a Promise program. So do they change their spending overall per full-time equivalent student? And then looking at these 4 categories that we would think would be the most likely to change once a Promise program is partners with a community college. So we looked at instruction, institutional support, academic support, as well as student support. And so what we found is, so this bar graph is showing you an aggregate estimate. And so this is the change of spending for community colleges with Promise programs after the Promise programs start. And so if you look at the bar graph in the red, that is the 30 Promise programs that are in our sample. And then we're breaking it down by different sources of funding for that Promise program. So there were 7 community colleges that partnered with a Promise program that was publicly funded. There were 8 community colleges that partnered with a Promise program that was privately funded. And then there were 12 community colleges that partnered with a Promise program that was a combination of sources. And so the way that you interpret this graph is that after the community college partnered with a Promise program, they changed or they increased their spending by $622 per student. And this is really being driven by the community colleges that partnered with a Promise program that was privately funded. So they increased their spending by $1,149 per full-time equivalent student. So this sounds extremely promising. So Bill Fox yesterday was talking about how the methods to estimate the effects has really rapidly changed over time. And so I'm just showing you really the aggregate effect, but we did, so the whole time period of our study was over 15 years. And so another way to estimate this effect is look at each estimate in each year of your study. And so when we do that, what we're seeing really is no effect in changes on overall spending over time. And so the way that you interpret this graph is, so over on the left side of the graph, before that vertical line, what you really want to see is that the confidence interval is overlapping zero, because that zero line, that horizontal zero line, means is there's no changing in spending. On the right side of the graph, what you really want to see is that confidence interval not crossing over that zero line. And since for the majority of our estimates in the post-promise period years is crossing over that zero, no change line, what we would say is there's really no changes in overall spending. For the ones in that first analysis that I showed you, that was statistically significant. So then we go until, instead of like overall spending, maybe what is happening is they're spending that in the specific categories that we think would help Promise Program students better navigate and get through college. And so we look at instruction, student services, academic support, and institutional support. Also, this looks pretty encouraging, right? So we see for instruction that community colleges that were partner with either a privately funded Promise program or a Promise program that is like a combination of sources, they are really increasing their spending anywhere between $302 to about $433 per full-time equivalent student. If we look to student services, we're also seeing an increase in spending for community colleges that either partner with a publicly funded Promise program or a Promise program that is a combination of sources. So that's anywhere between increasing their spending between $120 to $184 per full-time equivalent student. So as I'm imagining, you're now realizing, oh, now you're going to show us the other way to do this analysis. And when we do that, we kind of again see that there's no changes in spending for on instructional support. For the two programs, funding sources that we did see changes in the first analysis. And then when we turn to the student support services, we are seeing actually some changes. And so this provides some evidence that community colleges that partner with a Promise program that is publicly funded, we are seeing an increase in spending on student support services, but we are seeing no changes for the community colleges that partner with a Promise program that has a combination of sources, at least on their student support services. So you might be thinking about, all right, well, what does this really mean? So the different ways to do this analysis, we put more weight on that kind of longitudinal analysis where we're doing an estimate for each year in our analysis. So it really looks like over the time period of our study, at least for those 30 local Promise programs, is that for the majority of spending categories, they're really not making a lot of changes in their spending for those 4 categories and then overall spending. What could be happening though, so the iPads categories are very large, and so they capture not only Promise program spending, but all sorts of spending that is happening within a community college. And so we have another project where we're doing interviews with Promise program administrators to really better understand some of the funding and spending that's going on at the community college level. And anecdotally, some of what they're telling us is that you might have a student support service unit within a community college. And so instead of adding new staff when a Promise program starts, what really that you might be doing is repurposing that staff. And so if you have a staff of 4, maybe 1 or 2 folks are then dedicated to the Promise students. And so that type of shifting within what we would say the spending category is not going to be captured in this quantitative analysis. And so that is really why we're doing interviews and a more qualitative analysis to better understand the patterns that we're seeing on the quantitative side. And so, however, there is evidence, at least for community colleges that partner with a publicly funded Promise program, is that they are spending more on student support services, which frankly is fairly encouraging, particularly since we know that for these Promise programs, the community colleges are not getting any more money. That money is coming directly to the students themselves. And so the other thing that we see, which I didn't show you the graphs for the interest of time, is that community colleges that partner with a privately funded program is they are spending more on institutional support. And so the way that we interpret that is it could be what's happening is that they have a more accountability function. And so if they're getting private donations or corporate donations, they might have to be tracking those students more over time, as well as like reporting back to their donors about how their students are doing. And so that could be why they're spending more in institutional support. All right, so we're going to turn to that last project that we wanted to talk to you all about. And so we're moving away from the local Promise programs and now focusing on the statewide Promise programs. And this is kind of looking at more of the political dynamics that are going on within a state that is trying to adopt a statewide Promise program. So for this study, we're focusing on the New Mexico Opportunity Scholarship. So if you're not aware, the New Mexico Opportunity Scholarship was signed into law in March of 2022. And so there were all Democrats within the legislature voted yes on the bill, and there were 13 Republicans who voted no, 13 Republicans who voted yes, and 23 Republicans who voted no. And so the Opportunity Scholarship, if you're not familiar with it, it's considered to be one of the more generous of Promise programs because it's targeting adult learners as well as part-time students. And so for this project, we have 3 research questions, but I'm really going to focus on that first research question. So really looking at how do state legislators frame their support or opposition to the New Mexico Opportunity Scholarship. And so the data that we used in the design, it's a single case study of the Opportunity Scholarship. And so we listened to, transcribed, and coded the legislative meetings that they talked about the Opportunity Scholarship in January or February of 2022, and that was the Senate Education Committee, the Senate Finance Committee, as well as the House Education Committee. And we also listened to the House and the floor, or the House and the Senate floor votes. And so what we're seeing in terms of the 5 themes that came out from our analysis and how the state legislators were really framing their support or opposition, I'm really going to talk about the opposition because I think that's the most apt to thinking about our overall topic here on the funding of sustainable promise programs. And so if we look for the themes at the opposition, they're really all about financial considerations. And so that first theme is talking about putting non-recurring revenue into a recurring program. So there was really a lack of sufficient and stable funding, because the way that the Opportunity Scholarship was funded in the first 2 years is there was a small amount of recurring funding. And so the New Mexico Department of Education, they estimated that the program would cost anywhere between $65 to $75 million a year. So in that first year, they did have $75 million, but only $12 million of that was in recurring funds. In that second year, they had $36.5 million, but only $12 million of that, again, was in recurring funds. So there was a lot of concerns from both Republicans and Democrats is that we could be funding this program for 2 years, but then what is going to happen when we run out of funding? And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit, but I also want to talk about the second and third theme. And so because the Opportunity Scholarship was so flexible, there was some concerns that it was, quote unquote, too flexible. And so what would be happening is, since it was targeted to adult learners and part-time students, sometimes those students take a little bit longer to navigate and get through college. And so some of the legislators felt that, is this the best return on investment for state dollars? If these students are taking longer, or if they never get their degree, perhaps it is better to spend our money in a different area for our citizens. And then the last thing that we kind of heard about yesterday is this concept of students needing to have skin in the game. And so if we give students a free tuition to go to college, perhaps they're not as motivated as they would have been if they had to pay a little bit. So the concerns from some of the legislators was, if we can have them pay just a little bit of tuition, and then that would motivate them to finish because they had skin in the game. And so turning to that first theme, I just want to show you some representative quotes from 2 of the House of Representatives in New Mexico. So the first one is by a Republican, and he was really concerned about, since we have a lot of non-recurring funding in how we're going to pay for the Opportunity Scholarship for the first 2 years, is this really going to harm students? So I just want to say, so this lack of funding really takes away their opportunity, and we got them started, meaning the state, but we didn't get them finished. How many students could potentially be hurt by that? And so there was another representative who was a Democrat who was thinking about, yes, we are really concerned about the funding and the fact that we really have insufficient and not stable funding for the first 2 years of the program. However, what she talked about is, right now, when we have these funds and when we have this need, I ask that every member of this House together make this investment in New Mexicans and their future. And so she really felt, as well as some Democrats, that this student demand really should urge us to pass this bill, and then we will figure out how to have more stable funding in the next legislative session. And so really some of the takeaways for this is that if you're thinking about within your state to do a statewide promise program, funding is essential, right? Especially to build bipartisan support. And so in terms of at least how the Opportunity Scholarship was funded in the first 2 years, is that, most Republicans felt that because of this insufficient and unstable funding, is that the bill should be killed, honestly. But the Democrats really showed that, we have this need. We need to pass the Opportunity Scholarship and then figure out the funding in the next legislative session. And to be fair, after the Opportunity Scholarship was passed, the legislature appropriated $146 million in reoccurring funds, which was a 1,100% increase in what they had previously. So in the interest of time, I will leave it at that, and feel free to email, myself or Rosa if you have any questions.
Do we have any? We could probably take one or two questions, short, if anyone has them. Hold, please.
Thank you. Great presentation. Have you done, or are you going to consider doing any research on the financial impact of an ASAP type program on the cost of a community college and the Promise program?
Oh, we have not. I do know that there are other researchers kind of doing that work. I think MDRC researchers. We have not kind of looked at like the ASAP program, which has an extensive wraparound support services. And I know that they're trying to also replicate that in Ohio by doing some pilot programs over there. But we have not done that work.
Okay, one more question over here, and then we'll wrap.
Hi, Megan Barley-Fogarty with Centro Hispano here in Knoxville. So we're really blessed in this area to have strong public support for the Tennessee Promise with a kind of long-standing, public support, ongoing recurring funds. However, a lot of the students I work with are immigrant students, and so because they're not eligible for state funding here in the state of Tennessee and have to pay out-of-state tuition, they then become ineligible for that funding. And so I'm curious about, as you're looking at different funding sources and the combination of private-public funds, how that affected the eligibility of different Promise programs in terms of the students that were able to then access those programs.
Yeah, so the Promise programs that we looked at in the 30 Promise programs for the spending analysis. So in terms of eligibility, I would say they varied a lot. So there isn't really a great story on that side because their design elements were really different. I would say for those programs, none of them allowed undocumented students or international students to be eligible for the Promise Scholarship. This was really focused on those that are within a specific geographic area, usually the local ISD or several ISDs that were close to or within the same community for the Promise program.
I just want to briefly mention that I'm currently doing a different study on 45 statewide Promise programs. And about 25% of them circumvent the FAFSA and utilize their own their state financial aid forms for Dreamers and undocumented students. But that isn't a strain of research that I want to conduct, and it's definitely something that's happening, and they're being very creative about how they go about it, and they're very proud of it. And so there are certainly states that are addressing that dire need.
Thank you so much for being here, ladies. Everyone, let's give Dr. Billings and Dr. Acevedo a nice round of applause. All right. So as you know, it truly takes a village to sustain a successful Promise program, and our employees